Well, Blackpool, during the war, as far as holiday making went, nearly completely shut down. We had civil servants were moved up here. There's a few sites that were built around Blackpool, big sites of prefab huts that were built to civil servants came in to get them out of London, get them into safety. But mainly it was taken over by the Air Ministry because we had 15,000 beds going spare. The British government hadn't realised that the German bombers, they thought German bombers wouldn't be able to reach this far because they didn't realise that Holland and Belgium were going to be invaded, so they assumed that the bombers were coming from Germany and they couldn't get up this far. So Blackpool was fairly free and clear. So they turned it into a massive training base and throughout Blackpool and villages around, because they also built bases around Blackpool, they trained 750,000 air crew and ground crew. What we're going to talk about is the Dowding system. Now, although you have the Battle of Britain pilots who were up there fighting, behind them there was a big organisation. At the beginning of the Second World War, the British Air Force was outnumbered 4-1. So it's very important that we got our aircraft into the right place at the right time, so we didn't waste resources. So there was this system developed before the war, and it's called the Dowding system, and it's named after Sir Hugh Dowding, who was the Air Chief Marshal of the Fighter Command. We had radar, and as they also said, radar only pointed outwards, and these days they have the spinning things that can see all around, but in those days we could only direct it outwards. So when you had an incoming aircraft, it would be picked up by radar. Radar would then send the information to the filter room. Now the filter room is obviously very important because A, they get an overall picture, but also if you got, say, 2 radar stations and they both picked up the same aircraft, they could filter out. There was only one coming in, so they cleared a lot of the chaff out of the way. Now Bentley Priory, because they were aware of all the raids going on, they allocated a number. So in this case, say there's a squadron of aircraft coming in, this would be labelled 67, hostile 67, and that would then be placed on the map. As the plane progressed, we had the Royal Observer Corps. Now the Royal Observer Corps, there was 10,000 and they were volunteers. A lot of them were just placed in any high position, and you might get one man and somebody else. There'd be the two of them. The chap that, when he came in, his grandfather was part of the Royal Observer Corps, and he sat on a water tower. And what he had was, he was sitting on the water tower, they had some pennies, and they had a bicycle. And the fellow with the binoculars would spot the aircraft coming in, the other fella would get some pennies, and the reason for the pennies is, back in England in those days, our telephone boxes, you phoned a number, and when somebody answered, you put pennies in, so so the call would go through. So they would phone Bentley Priory, he would get on his bicycle, pedal to the nearest telephone box, phone up. I mean, it's real sort of Dad's Army stuff, this, it's just nuts, but it worked. As the aircraft progressed up, they were being spotted all the time. Everywhere that there was a high point, and you had the Royal Observer Corps, they were spotting. And what they did was, as they plotted it, they had these little coloured arrows. There's a red one, there's a yellow one, and somebody's pinched the blue one. And those relate to the clock. You see the little triangles on the clock? If a report came in and the aircraft had moved forward, what colour are we on now? We're going on to red. They would put a red arrow behind the plot. As it moved up, say it gets another 5 minutes up, they would move it forward again and they would put a yellow arrow on it. And the reason for this was because these guys, who are the ones that are going to be talking to the squadrons and getting them up, it told them that the information was no older than 5 minutes, because you had the 3 colours there, you had the red, blue and yellow. So as it moved up, they kept moving, taking the old ones away. So they knew the information was no more than 5 minutes old, so they knew exactly where these aircraft were. Now these chaps were also watching the board, and those were the squadron boards, and they had to decide which aircraft to send up in order to meet the German aircraft coming in. So they would be watching this, they would be speaking to the squadrons. They were watching the board. Now the board would tell them what aircraft were available. We never wanted all the aircraft up in the air at the same time. A Spitfire in fighting mode would probably have about 30 minutes fuel. It didn't carry a lot of fuel. Your aircraft, your Messerschmitts, once they got over the coast down south, they only had 15 minutes fuel. So the bombers were often left on their own. What you didn't want is you didn't want all your planes on the ground at the same time getting refuelled and rearmed. So you had to have some aircraft in the air, some ready to go, some getting refuelled and armed, and that's what these guys were looking for. So if they're coming up towards Liverpool, they'd be getting tracked. The squadron here would be scrambled up and they would come up. They knew the height, they knew the direction, and the idea was to get the aircraft up and above the enemy aircraft. The Americans, the British did it with filling formations, and one of the reasons for that was so they could keep each other covered. They had the crossfire from each of the aircraft. But the idea was to split them up, because if you split them up, they're a lot easier then to attack. We have the Spitfires. Well, out there you'll see the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. The general idea was that the Spitfires would take on any protecting fighters, and the Hurricanes would go through after the bombers. The Hurricanes were not quite as nippy as the German Messerschmitts. That's a radar set there. That's what they were looking at. And all they saw in that little round window was a green line, and that was the signal. When it hit a bomber, when the radar signal hit a bomber and bounced back, what it did is it put a blip. That's all they had. These days, when you look at them, you can see the aircraft, you can see the aircraft number, you get all sorts of information. But in that days, all they got was a blip, and they became very adept at reading from that blip the size of the formation coming in, and the speed and the height. Another little interesting fact is these girls here, the WAFs who are moving these around, they are listening in one ear to Bentley Priory. They're talking to Bentley Priory. They're also having to listen to what these guys are saying. And then as the pilots got up in the air, they could also hear on the radio what the pilots were saying. Men also did this job, but after the age of 30, they were taken out. They couldn't do it. Only women could deal with that amount of information all coming in at once. Men couldn't do it after the age of 30. They just had it. But that's how it worked, basically. And I hate to say it, guys, but you guys never actually worked out how we managed to get our fighters up in front of your bombers all the time. It was a strange thing, but German pilots and everything used to report that they couldn't understand how come our fighters were always there waiting for them. And it was because of this system. It was a totally integrated defence system.